November 28, 1966, Hollywood, California. Gold Star Studios. The room smells like an arson investigation. The air is thick, choking, and hazy, not just with the usual cigarette smoke of a 1960s recording session, but with the heavy, acrid stench of actual burning wood. In the center of the room stands a bucket. Inside the bucket, wood logs are burning. The flames flicker, casting long, dancing shadows against the acoustic tiles of the studio walls. Surrounding this small, controlled inferno is a group of the finest classical musicians in Los Angeles. These are men and women who have played in symphony orchestras, who are accustomed to tuxedos and concert halls. But tonight, they are not wearing formal wear. They are wearing red plastic fire helmets. Standing at the mixing console, separated from the musicians by a pane of glass, is a 24-year-old man. He is wearing a bathrobe. His eyes are wide, darting, frantic. He is the conductor of this surreal circus. He is Brian Wilson, and he is convinced that he is not just recording music. He believes he is rewriting the laws of physics. He hits the talkback button. He instructs the string section to play. But he doesn't want a melody. He wants the sound of panic. He wants the violins to screech like sirens. He wants the music to feel hot. He wants to capture the sonic essence of fire. The tape rolls. The musicians play. The fire crackles in the bucket. The smoke rises. It is a moment of pure, unadulterated, artistic madness. And then, the impossible happens. A few hours later, just down the street from the studio, a building bursts into flames. Sirens wail through the Hollywood night. The sky turns orange. When Brian Wilson hears the news, he doesn't see it as a coincidence. In his fragile, drug-altered and pressure-cooked mind, he sees it as cause and effect. He believes that he has summoned the fire. He believes that the music he put on tape was so powerful, so elemental, that it manifested destruction in the real world. He believes he has committed an act of musical witchcraft. Terrified, paranoid, and shaking, Brian orders the destruction of the master tape. He tries to burn the demon he created. This moment, the fire session, is the perfect epitaph for the story we are about to tell. It is the story of an artistic ambition so high that it burned up on re-entry. For nearly 40 years, the album that Brian Wilson was trying to create that night, an album titled Smile, was the Titanic of the music industry. It was the most famous shipwreck in history. It was the greatest album never released. It was a ghost story whispered about by record collectors, bootleggers, and rock stars. It was supposed to be the American answer to the Beatles. It was supposed to be a teenage symphony to God that would elevate pop music from the car radio to the cathedral. It was supposed to change the world. Instead, it destroyed its creator. This is not just a story about a canceled record. This is a forensic investigation into the collapse of a genius. It is the story of a young man caught in a pincer movement between the crushing commercial demands of the American music machine and the expanding, terrifying horizons of the psychedelic counterculture. It is a story of sandboxes in living rooms, tents in recording studios, vegetable chants, and a rivalry with Paul McCartney that existed almost entirely inside one man's head. This is the myth and the madness of Smile, the album that broke Brian Wilson, and the 37-year journey to put the pieces back together. To understand the height from which Smile fell, we have to understand the mountain Brian Wilson had just climbed. In the summer of 1966, the Beach Boys were not just a band. They were an American industrial powerhouse. They had spent 5 years selling a perfectly packaged California dream of surfing, cars, and girls to a world that couldn't get enough of it. But Brian Wilson, the architect of that dream, had retired. In December 1964, on a flight to Houston, Brian suffered a massive panic attack. The pressure of touring, writing, producing, and living up to the sun-drenched image while battling an abusive father and his own deepening insecurities had snapped his mind. He was 22 years old. He quit the road. He sent the rest of the band on tour. His brothers Dennis and Carl, his cousin Mike Love, and friend Al Jardine, while he stayed home in Los Angeles. He retreated into the recording studio, the only place he felt safe, the only place where he could control the environment. For a year, while the band was out playing fun in high school gymnasiums across the country, Brian was alone in the studio, deconstructing rock and roll. He wasn't using his bandmates to play the instruments anymore. He was using the Wrecking Crew, a legendary group of jazz-trained session musicians, Hal Blaine on drums, Carol Kay on bass, Glenn Campbell on guitar. Brian used these virtuosos like colors on a palette. He would combine instruments in unheard-of ways. 2 bass guitars playing at the same time, a harpsichord layered with a tack piano, accordions playing alongside flutes. He was chasing sounds he heard in his head, sounds that no one else could imagine. The result, released in May 1961, was Pet Sounds. Pet Sounds was a masterpiece of Baroque pop. It was melancholy, introspective, and lush. It was an album about the pain of growing up, set to the most sophisticated arrangements ever heard on a pop record. But it was also a commercial disappointment in America. It stalled at number 10 on the charts. The record label Capitol hated it. They thought it was too sad, too weird. They buried it. But 5,000 miles away, in London, 2 people heard it, and it changed their lives. John Lennon and Paul McCartney were obsessed with Pet Sounds. Paul McCartney later called God Only Knows the greatest song ever written. They heard what Brian was doing, using the recording studio as an instrument itself, and they realized the bar had been raised. The Beatles went into Abbey Road Studios. They responded to Pet Sounds with Revolver, and then immediately began work on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Across the Atlantic, Brian Wilson felt the shift. He was fiercely, almost pathologically, competitive. He heard the rumors of what the Beatles were doing. He knew they were coming for him. He told his wife, Marilyn, "The Beatles are ahead of me. I have to catch up. No, I have to jump ahead of them." He didn't want to make another Pet Sounds. That was too personal, too emotional. He wanted to make something bigger. He wanted to make something universal. He envisioned an album that would be a musical journey across America. A sonic collage that would blend doo-wop, Gershwin, cowboy songs, Hawaiian chants, classical music, and sound effects into a seamless, flowing suite. He called it a teenage symphony to God. He wanted music that could make people laugh, make them cry, and, in the lexicon of the emerging counterculture, blow their minds. He called the project Smile. He was convinced that with this album, he wouldn't just beat the Beatles. He believed he would create a new form of music that would bring peace and joy to a world that was rapidly tearing itself apart. He was 24 years old. He was a genius. He was at the peak of his powers, and he was standing on the edge of a cliff. To build his cathedral, Brian Wilson needed a new kind of bricklayer. He couldn't write the lyrics himself. His own words were too simple, too direct. And he certainly couldn't ask Mike Love, whose lyrical sensibilities were firmly planted in the world of high school romance and hot rods. He found his partner in a wildly articulate, diminutive, and intellectual 23-year-old musician named Van Dyke Parks. Parks was the antithesis of a beach boy. He wasn't a surfer. He was a Southern aristocrat of the counterculture, a man who spoke in riddles, puns, and poetic fragments. He didn't write about girls. He wrote about the American frontier, the transcontinental railroad, the plight of the Native American, and the elemental forces of nature. Together, they embarked on a collaboration that was less like songwriting and more like telepathy. But to capture this new sound, Brian decided that the standard recording studio environment was too sterile. He needed to change the atmosphere. He needed to bring the beach to his home, but in a way that was entirely artificial. In what has become the most famous anecdote of the Smile Sessions, Brian Wilson had the dining room of his Bel Air mansion converted into a sandbox. He hired contractors to build a retaining wall and fill the room with 8 tons of premium beach sand. He placed his grand piano in the center of it. For months, Brian Wilson wrote the greatest music of his life while sitting at a piano, his bare feet buried in the sand, composing under the influence of marijuana, hashish, and amphetamines. It was a perfect metaphor for his state of mind. He was trying to stay connected to the beach brand, but he was doing it inside a walled-off, artificial environment, completely isolated from reality. He also constructed a $30,000 Arabian tent in his living room, where he and the cool people of Hollywood, Danny Hutton, David Crosby, would sit, smoke, and eat health food while listening to the acetates of the day's recording. The recording process itself was a descent into a beautiful madness. Brian abandoned the idea of recording a song from start to finish. Instead, he utilized a technique he called modular recording. He would record tiny fragments of music, sometimes only 10 or 20 seconds long, a cello line here, a vocal chant there, a sound effect of a train whistle, a sawing motion on a cello. He called them feels. He recorded hundreds of these fragments. His plan was to take these thousands of hours of tape, cut them up with a razor blade, and tape them back together to form a cohesive whole. It was like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle that was constantly changing shape, without a picture on the box to guide you. The lead single, Good Vibrations, released in late 1966, was the proof of concept. It was constructed from over 90 hours of tape and countless edits. It was a massive global #1 hit. It proved to Brian that his method worked. It proved he was invincible. But Good Vibrations took 6 months to make. Now, he had to make an entire album this way. As the sessions stretched into late 1966 and early 1967, the music became increasingly abstract. The tracks for Smile, songs like Heroes and Villains, Cabin Essence, and Surf's Up, were unlike anything in Western pop music. They were complex, shifting, Aaron Copland meets the Twilight Zone compositions. But while Brian was building his sandcastles in the studio, the real world was about to kick down the door. The rest of the Beach Boys were returning from tour. This is the moment the dream began to curdle. Mike Love, Al Jardine, and Bruce Johnston walked into the studio expecting to record the next California Girls. They expected hits. They expected checks. Instead, they walked into a dark, smoky room filled with people in fire helmets. They saw Brian, overweight and paranoid, directing a cello player to make cartoon sounds. And then, they were handed the lyric sheets written by Van Dyke Parks. The conflict that ensued is legendary. It was the clash of two irreconcilable forces, art versus commerce. Mike Love read the lyrics to Cabin Essence, a song about the Chinese laborers who built the railroads. He looked at the line, "Over and over the crow cries, uncover the cornfield." He turned to Brian. He turned to Van Dyke Parks. And he asked the question that would haunt the project forever. What the F does that mean? To Mike Love, this wasn't art. It was gibberish. It was acid alliteration. He warned Brian that he was alienating their fans. He famously told him, "Don't F with the formula." He argued that the people buying Beach Boys records were high school kids in Ohio who wanted to dance, not philosophy majors who wanted to decode poetry about crows and cornfields. Brian was crushed. He was a fragile soul who craved approval. He looked up to Mike Love. He wanted his family to love his work, but every time he played them a new piece of his symphony, he was met with skepticism, confusion, or outright hostility. The studio, once his sanctuary, became a battlefield. Van Dyke Parks, unable to handle the aggression from Mike Love, eventually walked away from the project. The vibes were bad, he later said. Brian was left alone. He was alone in his sandbox. He was alone with hundreds of reels of tape that made no sense to anyone but him. The teenage symphony to God was turning into a cacophony, and the pressure was building. Capitol Records had already printed the album covers. They were demanding the master tapes. The Beatles were rumored to be finishing their masterpiece. Brian Wilson looked at the mountain of tape reels, and for the first time, he realized he didn't know how to put them together. The puzzle was too big. The pieces didn't fit, and the fire in his mind was no longer fueling the engine. It was burning down the house. By the spring of 1967, the sandbox had become a quicksand pit. Brian Wilson was no longer just eccentric. He was disintegrating. The playful creativity that had birthed good vibrations had hardened into a terrifying paranoia. He became convinced that his house was bugged. He believed that his rival, producer Phil Spector, had planted microphones in his light fixtures to steal his ideas. He stopped holding meetings in his office and started holding them in the deep end of his swimming pool, convinced that the water would scramble the listening devices. He began to see omens everywhere. A painting on his wall terrified him. He thought it was stealing his soul. He believed the FBI was watching him because of the subversive lyrics Van Dyke Parks was writing. The fire session had convinced him he had supernatural powers he couldn't control. And then the British arrived. In April 1967, Paul McCartney flew to Los Angeles. He was there to visit friends, but he also wanted to see Brian. The meeting between the two titans of 60s pop is one of the most poignant scenes in music history. McCartney walked into the studio where Brian was working. He was confident, charming, and riding the crest of the wave. Brian was unshaven, overweight, and wearing a bathrobe. McCartney sat at the piano and played "She's Leaving Home" from the upcoming Sgt. Pepper album. Brian listened. He heard the soaring melody, the perfect arrangement, the effortless emotion. It was everything he was trying to achieve with Smile, but it was finished. It was effortless. Brian tried to play McCartney some of Smile. He played Vegetables, a strange, whimsical track intended to be part of an Elements suite, Earth. In a surreal moment, Paul McCartney stood in the vocal booth, chewing on a stick of raw celery, providing percussive crunching noises for the track. It was meant to be fun. But the contrast was devastating. The Beatle was chewing vegetables on a track that was disjointed and weird, while his own band was about to release the greatest album of all time. Brian felt the gap widening. The fatal blow came over the car radio. Driving around Los Angeles, Brian heard the new Beatles single, "Strawberry Fields Forever." He listened to the complex editing, the psychedelic textures, the fade out and fade in. He pulled his car to the side of the road. He sat there, gripping the steering wheel, tears streaming down his face. He turned to his passenger and said, "They got there first." He believed that the Beatles had tapped into the same cosmic wave he was surfing. but they had ridden it all the way to the shore while he was drowning in the break. He felt that Smile, even if he finished it, would now look like a copy. He had lost the race. The pressure from the record label was now unbearable. Capitol Records was threatening lawsuits. The band was in open revolt. Van Dyke Parks was gone. Brian's mind was fracturing. He couldn't distinguish between the music and the voices in his head. In May 1967, Brian Wilson made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He called the studio, he called the label, and he stopped the tape. The publicist, Derek Taylor, issued a press release that was as vague as it was tragic. He announced that Smile had been scrapped and that the tapes would be shelved. It was an unprecedented act of artistic suicide. The most anticipated album in the world, the follow-up to Good Vibrations, simply ceased to exist. In its place, the band hastily recorded and released Smiley Smile in September 1967. It was a bizarre, lo-fi, stoned version of the Smile material. It was recorded in Brian's living room. It was minimalist, spooky, and strange. It sounded like a group of ghosts whispering the songs that were meant to be shouted from the mountaintops. The critics were baffled. The public was indifferent. Smiley Smile flopped. The Beach Boys went from being the hippest band in America to being uncool almost overnight. They missed the summer of love. They were seen as washouts. Brian Wilson retreated. He took down the tent. He got rid of the sand. He retreated to his bedroom, closed the curtains, and didn't really come out for decades. The genius who had tried to write a symphony to God had been broken by the silence of his own failure. For 37 years, Smile was not an album. It was a rumor. It was the holy grail of rock and roll. While Brian Wilson spent the 1970s and 80s lost in a fog of mental illness, addiction, and controversial psychiatric treatments under Dr. Eugene Landy, the tapes of Smile sat in the Capitol Records vault. They were the most bootlegged recordings in history. Fans would trade grainy, fourth-generation cassette tapes of heroes and villains, or fragments of Surf's Up, like they were religious relics. They tried to assemble the puzzle themselves, arguing over track listings and sequences. The legend of the album grew larger than the music itself. It became a symbol of lost potential. It was the what if that haunted every discussion about the 1960s. If Smile had come out, people whispered, the Beach Boys would have been bigger than the Beatles. But for Brian Wilson, the word smile was a trigger. It was a source of PTSD. Whenever interviewers asked him about it, he would shut down. He called it inappropriate music. He said it was cursed. He was terrified of the memories associated with it. The fire, the paranoia, the failure. He wanted it to stay buried. However, the music refused to die. In the early 2000s, a new generation of musicians and fans began to champion Brian Wilson's work. He began to tour again, tentatively, with a new band, the Wondermints, musicians who had grown up worshiping his arrangements. They knew the songs better than he did. They treated him with the reverence he deserved. Slowly, gently, his new musical director, Darian Sahanaja, began to coax him. "Brian," he would say, "what about Smile?" At first, Brian panicked, but something had changed. He was medicated correctly. He was surrounded by love, not pressure. He was stable. And deep down, the artist in him still wanted to finish the symphony. In 2003, Brian Wilson did the unthinkable. He agreed to revisit Smile. But he didn't go back to the original tapes. He didn't want to deal with the ghosts of the Beach Boys or the legal red tape of Capitol Records. He decided to re-record the entire album from scratch, live, with his new band. He called Van Dyke Parks. The The two men, now in their 60s, reunited. They sat down at the piano, picked up the pieces of the puzzle they had abandoned in 1967, and finally figured out how they fit together. They wrote new lyrics to bridge the gaps. They finalized the sequence. They finished the Teenage Symphony. The live premiere took place at the Royal Festival Hall in London on February 20th, 2004. The atmosphere was tense. The audience included Paul McCartney, who was there to cheer on his old rival. When the lights went down and the opening a cappella chord of Our Prayer filled the hall, grown men in the audience began to weep. For the next hour, Brian Wilson conducted his masterpiece. He led the band through the sweets of Americana, the cowboy songs, the barnyard noises, the Hawaiian chants, the elements. It flowed. It made sense. It was beautiful, funny, strange, and majestic. When the final note of Good Vibrations rang out, the ovation was deafening. It lasted for minutes. Brian Wilson stood center stage looking stunned. The curse was broken. The fire was out. The monster that had lived in his closet for 4 decades had been turned into a butterfly. Later that year, Brian released Brian Wilson Presents Smile as a studio album. It won a Grammy. It was universally acclaimed. But the true victory wasn't the award. It was the closure. Brian Wilson had gone back to the scene of the crime, the scene of his own mental collapse, and he had survived. He had reclaimed his narrative. He proved that the music wasn't witchcraft or madness. It was just genius that had arrived too early for the world to understand. The release of Smile finally allowed the world to hear what Brian had heard in his head in 1966. It was a vindication of his vision. It showed that he really was reaching for God, even if he burned his wings on the way up. When Brian Wilson passed away in 2025, the obituaries didn't focus on the lost years, or the drug addiction, or the sandbox. They focused on the music. They focused on the fact that he lived long enough to finish his work. The story of Smile is the ultimate tragedy and the ultimate triumph of American pop music. It teaches us that art is dangerous. It requires a vulnerability that can break a person. But it also teaches us that art is resilient. It can wait. It can survive in a vault, on a bootleg tape, or in the back of a broken mind, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Brian Wilson finally finished his symphony. He finally beat the Beatles, not on the charts, but in the history books of the human spirit. He caught the wave, he fell off, and 37 years later, he got back on and rode it all the way to the beach. And in the end, the title was accurate. After all the pain, all the fire, and all the tears, the only thing left to do was smile. These are the stories that define our culture, the hidden struggles behind the masterpieces. If you want to keep exploring the secret history of music with us, hit that subscribe button. The symphony continues.